This episode contains graphic content that may not be suitable for all ages. Listener discretion is advised. If you or someone you know is struggling or in crisis, help is available. Call or text 988 or chat with someone at 988lifeline.org. Those outside of the US, reach out to someone at your local crisis center or hotline. Please do not suffer in silence. Southern Illinois is a land of wide fields and narrow roads, where farmland stretches for miles and small towns dot the horizon like fading footprints. Tucked off of Interstate 57, between the cornfields and coal veins, lies the village of Ena, a quiet place that most people pass without ever noticing. With a population that hovers around 400, Ena is the kind of place where everyone seems to know each other's name, where doors were once left unlocked, and the rhythm of daily life felt untouched by the chaos of the outside world. The area has long been home to farming families, blue-collar workers, and the occasional drifter just passing through. In the 1980s, it felt like the sort of place people might move to for peace and calm, a quiet corner of America where you could raise a family in stillness. But in the fall of 1987, that illusion of safety was forever shattered. Something horrific happened here. Something sudden and brutal that remains completely unexplained nearly 4 decades later. It is a mystery that still lingers, carved into the very soil of Jefferson County. This is the story of the Dardeen family. Ruby Elaine Cowling was born on August 10, 1957 in Fairfield, Illinois, and was one of just 4 children. By all indications, she was a normal young woman who eventually met the man she would fall in love with whom she would settle down and start a family with. Russell Keith Dardeen was a bit younger than Ruby, born on June 22, 1958, as one of 2 children. Despite having the first name Russell, he eventually went by his middle name Keith, which is a bit coincidental because Elaine did the same thing. Having grown up near Mount Carmel, a town in southeastern Illinois, Keith's parents split up early in his life, but he remained close with both of them. According to a 2007 article by 14 News, he even shared a love of true crime with his mother, Joanne. Elaine and Keith met early in life, marrying in August 1979, when both would have been in their early 20s. And by all indications, the two were a normal, happy couple that clearly loved one another. They were active in their local Baptist church, and even played in the musical ensemble. Keith sang while Elaine played piano. The burgeoning Dardeen family lived in an area just outside of Ena, Illinois, which is an incredibly small town in southern Jefferson County, with a population under 500 at the time this story takes place in the mid-1980s. But that is what had actually drawn Keith and Elaine to Ena. It was quiet, but it wasn't too far away from where Elaine's family lived in Albion, Illinois. That gave them a bit of a support network as they struggled to find work and hoped to start a family of their own. They purchased a mobile home, renting some land from a local farming family to begin planting some roots of their own. Their first child, a son named Peter Sean Dardeen, was born on July 5, 1984. A few years later, in 1987, Elaine became pregnant with their second child, who they planned on naming either Ian or Casey, depending upon the baby's sex assigned at birth. At that point, both Keith and Elaine had found steady employment. Keith had begun to receive training to become a treatment plant operator for the Red Lake Water Conservancy, and Elaine planned to begin working as a secretary at a nearby office supply firm in Mount Vernon, Illinois. Things seemed to be going well for the Dardeen family, but sadly, their joy was anything but permanent. In 1987, as Keith and Elaine eagerly awaited the birth of their second child, their future in Ena, Illinois began to look less certain than ever before. Keith's family would later remark that he had talked about the raising crime rate in the region, with it not being the type of environment that he wanted to raise his children in. In particular, this raising crime rate seemed to reference the area's shockingly high violent crime rate, which totaled 15 homicides over the prior 2 years, as well as an untold number of assaults and sexual assaults. Understandably, with a pregnant wife and 2 young children to think of now, Keith began looking to the future, and his worry began to grow into paranoia. Rumor has it that a woman approached the Dardeen family's home late one night, and Keith refused to let her in to use the telephone. In 1987, Keith began making plans to return the family to Mount Carmel, where he had grown up. He planned to do so even if he could not find a job there ahead of time, with the lack of job prospects being the thing that had compelled him and Elaine to move to Ena. But now, according to Keith, it just wasn't worth it. Later that year, Keith and Elaine put their mobile home up for sale and began making plans to head back to Mount Vernon before their second child was born. By then, they had learned that it was going to be a girl. When speaking to his mother on the phone, Keith told her that they were moving back to Mount Carmel in the near future. On the weekend of November 14th and 15th of 1987, as Thanksgiving approached, Keith and Elaine drove to Albion to visit Elaine's family. They drove back that Monday, and Elaine called her family late that evening, on November 16th, to let them know that they had made it back home safely. This would be the last time that anyone heard from the Dardeen family. November 18th, 1987, started off like any regular Wednesday in Ena, Illinois. But that morning, Keith failed to make it to work, something that was very unlike him. Normally described as very punctual and responsible, Keith not even making an attempt to get in touch with his supervisor to let them know that he was going to be late or absent was described as being very out of the ordinary for him. But his coworkers knew that Elaine was far along in her pregnancy, so they wanted to give Keith a little bit of leeway with his tardiness before raising any alarm. Supervisors at the Water Conservancy facility attempted to call Keith at home, but the calls rang through straight to voicemail. Hours began to pass. Keith had still not shown up to work or attempted to make contact. Soon it was learned that he had not shown up on Monday to pick up his paycheck, which was merely another notch in the strange column. At the time, coworkers thought he had just been waiting until his next day of work, Wednesday, to pick up his paycheck. But here they were, and still no Keith. The Daily Republican Register, a local newspaper, reported that a superintendent for the water system actually drove out to the Dardeen family's mobile home that day in an attempt to rouse Keith, but nobody responded to his knocks at the door. Soon thereafter, supervisors started reaching out to their other family members, including Keith's mom and dad, who were divorced but both still lived in Mount Carmel, roughly 70 miles east. Both of Keith's parents had no idea why he would be absent from work without calling in. It took Keith's dad, Don, little convincing to begin driving out to Keith's trailer in Ena, over an hour away, to check in on him. Since Don had a spare key, he would be able to at least get inside to see if they had left behind a note or something. And he would meet police there, who had been called and asked to perform a wellness check on Keith, Peter, and the pregnant Elaine. Don Dardeen made it to Keith and Elaine's mobile home at around 6 p.m. that Wednesday, noting upon his arrival that Keith's vehicle, a red 1981 Plymouth, was missing. But present at the scene were a couple of police officers, giving them the spare key so that they could enter the mobile home. Inside the Dardeen family home, officers would find a scene beyond their small-town comprehension. Tucked into the same bed were the bodies of 30-year-old Elaine Dardeen and her son, 3-year-old Peter. Both had been beaten severely with a baseball bat, which had been a birthday gift for Peter earlier that year and had been left at the scene. But shockingly, what investigators also found, next to those 2 bodies, was the smaller body of Keith and Elaine's baby girl, who they had planned on naming Casey. What authorities would later learn is that while Elaine and Peter were being beaten to death, Elaine's body had gone into labor. In the process, she ended up delivering Casey, but sadly, Casey was found alongside her mother and brother, having met the same violent fate, likely just minutes after she was born. All 3 were tucked into the same bed, but Elaine had evidently suffered more than the others. She had been bound and gagged with duct tape. While reporters over the years have suggested that Elaine was raped, that has never been confirmed by law enforcement. Notably absent from the scene, though, was the family patriarch, 29-year-old Keith Dardeen, whose absence from work had inspired this wellness check in the first place. His car was missing from the vicinity of the trailer, and officers immediately began searching for him throughout the area. Because of his family's brutal and tragic end, and his absence from the scene, he undoubtedly became the top suspect in this savage crime. Police from all over the state were preparing to embark on an epic manhunt to find Keith, but sadly, they would never get the chance, due to another gruesome discovery made the very next day. On Thursday, November 19th, 1987, residents throughout Illinois' Jefferson County were on edge. Even though only a few details had made it out to the public, the story was becoming the talk of the town, and police made it clear that they were looking for Keith Dardeen, the missing patriarch of a family that had just been slaughtered. He, along with his missing vehicle, were at the top of mind for every officer heading out on duty throughout the county. A contingent of police traveled out to Keith's mother's home in Mount Vernon, learning that he had not been out there in quite a while. That Thursday, just hours after the bodies of Elaine, Peter, and Casey were found inside the family's mobile home, authorities discovered Keith's red Plymouth. Surprisingly, it had been parked outside of the police station in Benton, Illinois, roughly 11 miles south of the Dardeen trailer. The interior of the vehicle was spattered with blood, but Keith was still nowhere to be found. Later that day, though, hunters would make a gruesome discovery roughly a mile and a half away from the Dardeen mobile home, across county lines in a field in rural Franklin County. There, they discovered the body of Keith Dardeen, who had been shot 3 times in the head. As police would later learn, he had been killed in an apparent homicide, and based on the status of his remains, he had likely died within an hour of his family being killed. To make matters even more concerning, and honestly bizarre, whoever had killed Keith had taken the mutilation of his corpse one step further. They had severed his penis from his body, indicating to investigators that this was either sadistic or an incredibly personal crime, possibly both, the notion of which would loom large over the investigation over the next several years. While this discovery would raise many more questions about the deaths of the Dardeen family, it did clear up one matter: the notion of Keith being the killer. It was evident that he had been killed at around the same time as the rest of his family, but it was hard to determine how things had happened the way they did, and why. More after the break. Because the murders of Elaine, Peter, and Casey had happened in one county, and the body of Keith had been found in another, the jurisdiction of this case was tricky to figure out from the jump, but the various police agencies, city, county, and state, would be overseen by the Illinois State Police. At the primary crime scene, the family's home, police discovered that the back door had been left open, providing the assailant an easy access point. Since there was no sign of forced entry, this looked to be the most logical entry point for the killer. A bloody baseball bat was found at the scene, which had been a birthday present for 3-year-old Peter Dardeen. Authorities stated that this was likely the murder weapon of the 3 found in the mobile home: Peter, Elaine, and Casey. But over the years, they have not released any specific information about the gunshots to Keith's body, such as the caliber of the rounds, the probable make of the weapon, etc. At the scene, authorities reportedly found marijuana, but police had refrained from labeling it either Keith's or Elaine's. Neither were known drug users or dealers, and neither showed signs of any drug or alcohol use before their deaths, confirmed by toxicology testing conducted post-mortem. Some have speculated over the years that the killer may have planted the weed there in an attempt to try and mislead investigators, but that remains more of a loose theory regarding the case than anything. All 4 of the Dardeens are believed to have died within an hour of each other, with the bodies in the trailer having been deceased for approximately 12 hours at the time of their discovery on Wednesday evening. Keith, found the following day, had been deceased for anywhere between 24 and 36 hours, situating his death at around the same time as the others. The timing of this led police to believe that the killer had likely broken into the trailer during Tuesday evening, murdering the first 3 and then leading Keith away to a secondary location where he may have been killed or dumped. Because of the blood spatter found in Keith's vehicle, it was hard to determine just how exactly this series of events had played out. whether Keith had been killed either before or after his family. Whoever this killer had been, they appeared to have done a thorough job cleaning and or staging the crime scene, not only tucking Elaine into a bed with her 2 children after bludgeoning them to death with a baseball bat, but thoroughly scrubbing away any presence of themselves, such as fingerprints, blood, hair, etc. Whatever blood spatter had once been inside the mobile home had been cleaned up by the killer, indicating that they had come prepared for that in some way. Since we know that they were armed, made evident by the gunshot wounds to Keith's body, they had evidently come equipped with the means to kill. It's possible they had also come prepared to clean up any evidence of their involvement. As investigators tried piecing together how this crime had unfolded, they were struck by the more pressing question: the why. Why had someone gone out of their way to target this quiet family of 4? Why had they carried out this crime so violently, beating Elaine, 3-year-old Peter, and newborn Casey to death with a baseball bat? Why had they taken Keith to a secondary location and then castrated him? As I mentioned minutes ago, this crime had either been carried out by someone with sadistic impulses or by someone with a vengeful grudge against the family. But the sad thing is that no one had anything bad to say about the Dardeen family. Whatever motive may have existed seemed to be minuscule at best. Robbery did not seem to be a focus for this killer, with nothing of value missing from the scene. At least, nothing that friends or family of the Dardeens could point out. Keith and Elaine had an expensive VCR and camera in their living room, as well as some cash and items of jewelry squirreled away throughout the home, none of which appeared to have been touched. And it's not like this stuff was hidden. Police found it all with a cursory search. If this was a robbery, then the thieves had done a terrible job of making off with anything of value. Because of the crime's brutal nature, investigators began exploring the possibility of either Keith or Elaine having an extramarital affair. A vengeful spouse was one of the only possibilities that seemed likely, even though the extent to which they would have carried out that revenge to include the children made many police officials skeptical. Investigators even grilled Keith's friends and family for proof that he had been involved in a gay relationship outside of his marriage, based solely off the genital mutilation conducted by the killer, which certain investigators believe suggested homosexual overtones, as recounted over a decade later in a 2000 Chicago Tribune article. However, authorities could find no proof that either Keith or Elaine were anything but faithful to one another, nor could they find any evidence that either had a crazy ex or a stalker of any kind, or that Keith had been gay. There was the remote possibility that gambling may have been involved, due to some handwritten sports scores found all over the trailer, but this theory was disputed by family members of Keith's, who described him as an incredibly frugal individual, not the type to gamble away any of the family's money. Joanne Dardeen, his mother, said that Keith often resold 50-cent cans of soda at work to help save up for Peter's college fund, and carefully managed the family's finances. They found it impossible to think that he had been gambling at all, let alone to the extent of earning his family and he an extremely violent death. One of the last prevailing theories in this case, the one that is perhaps the most likely and also the most terrifying, is that this crime was totally random, perhaps spurred on by nothing more than the location of the Dardeens' mobile home itself. Their home was located along Route 37, a state highway, which was easily accessed by Interstate 57. It's possible that the killer or killers did not even know who Keith or Elaine were when they came upon the home, instead deciding to take advantage of the rural, isolated location to carry out some violent impulses. The lack of any definitive motive would go on to plague investigators, as closure continued to elude them in this strangely violent case as days and weeks transformed into months and then years. In the countless months following the Dardeen family murders, the entire area was on high alert, worried that whoever had struck this young family of 4 could strike again. Fear and rumor proliferated almost every conversation, and neither did much to help with the ongoing case. Among the rumors that began swirling during this period was a rumor that Keith had not been shot in the head, but rather dragged from a car. This seemed to stem from the fact that coroners in 2 different counties had handled the investigation, and both seemed to dispute the label of his death, one describing the wounds that had killed Keith as a head injury, while the other referred to it as a gunshot wound. Another rumor was the belief that a satanic cult had been involved. This one arose when the public learned about the gruesome nature of Elaine's beating, how she had given birth during the violent act, and had her newborn daughter killed at the scene. As you would imagine, the genital mutilation of Keith's body only added to those unsubstantiated claims. It does make sense though why these rumors would spread. This crime took place at the tail end of 1987, right in the middle of the big satanic panic craze sweeping the nation. Something that I've touched upon in prior episodes, including in the Acid King episode in which I detailed the Ricky Casso case alongside my good friend, author and director Jesse Pollock. But it seems like this may have just been another case sloppily linked to the craze due to nothing specific. Just a senseless, violent crime that residents were trying to make sense of, and a tailor-made answer that at least provided some kind of motive to the unknown perpetrator, or perpetrators. It's kinda hard to blame the residents for trying to make sense of this crime. As was the case with most unsolved murders, residents only received bits and pieces of information, with investigators and police officials not even having a good handle of the case themselves. Locals were understandably worried. They wanted answers, and police did not have them. Investigators were completely stumped. There was nothing about this case that was easily explained, and the more that they tried to figure it out, the more mystifying it seemed to become. FBI profilers would come out to review this case, but even they agreed that this crime defied their typical analytical methods. The specific details of the crime made any kind of ascertainable motive hard to pin down, and the lack of evidence left behind by the killer or killers left a void that police, for all their might and effort, were unable to fill. This lack of resolution caused the public to worry that they could be next, that the killer could be anyone, their coworker, their friend, their neighbor. Despite more than 30 detectives working on the case at one point and interviewing hundreds, if not thousands of people, investigators failed to charge anyone with the murders in the many months that followed. In the absence of an immediate culprit, investigators in 1987 had to consider every angle, from the local community to wandering serial killers. Early on, the unparalleled brutality of the crime fueled wild speculation. Rumors of a satanic cult were quickly dismissed by police, as the scene lacked any of the ritualistic markers that a cult might have left. Robbery and sexual assault were also ruled out, since valuables were untouched and Elaine had not been violated. With no clear motive, detectives even cautioned the Dardeens that the perpetrator might turn out to be someone close to them, a chilling thought in a small town where everyone knew each other. Keith and Elaine were a quiet, church-going couple with no known enemies, so this notion left the family grasping for explanations. At one point, Keith's mother, Joanne, voiced her own theories, wondering if someone had tried to involve Keith in drug dealing, or if someone liked Elaine and she wouldn't accept his advances, triggering a vengeful rage. Yet, these ideas were pure speculation. As I touched on beforehand, investigators found no evidence of any drug ties, infidelity, or a secret life that could explain such an atrocity. For a long time, it appeared that the Dardeens had been targeted at random by a phantom killer, leaving Jefferson County authorities with almost no suspects to pursue. As the case went cold, attention turned to known violent offenders who might fit the bill. One high-profile suspect emerged over a decade after the crime, in 1999. Angel Maturino Resendez, infamously known as the Railroad Killer. Resendez was a Mexican serial killer who roamed the US by hopping freight trains, often murdering victims near rail lines and sometimes bludgeoning entire families. The Dardeens' home sat not too far away from railroad tracks, and the modus operandi, a family beaten to death, bore a resemblance to some of the railroad killer's previous crimes. Illinois investigators were intrigued and briefly interested in Resendez after his capture. However, after checking his known whereabouts and patterns, they were never able to connect him to the Dardeen family. With no evidence tying Resendez to Ina, that lead fizzled out. The railroad killer ultimately had plenty of blood on his hands, but as far as police could tell, the Dardeen family were not among his victims. Not long after Resendez was eliminated, another notorious drifter fell under scrutiny, this time by his own admission. In 2000, while on death row in Texas, serial murderer Tommy Lynn Sells unexpectedly confessed that he was responsible for the Dardeen family's slaughter. Sells, a carnival worker and transient killer, was known for crisscrossing the country and committing brutal murders with various weapons. He often targeted strangers, even entire families, in their homes. To Jefferson County investigators starved for leads, Sells' claim seemed like a possible breakthrough. By his account, he had crossed paths with Keith Dardeen at an Illinois truck stop and been invited over for dinner, a scenario that put him inside the Dardeen home that fateful night in 1987. Sells alleged that once there, an argument ensued. In some retellings, he outrageously claimed Keith propositioned him for a sexual tryst, and that he quote-unquote lost it, massacring the family in a rage. To authorities, part of Sells' story rang true-ish. He described certain details of the crime scene that weren't common knowledge, and his violent MO certainly matched the level of carnage seen. At last, it seemed, a tangible suspect had stepped forward, one with a murderous resume capable of something this horrific. Yet, as investigators dug deeper into the confession of Tommy Lynn Sells, significant doubts arose. Sells already had a reputation for spinning tall tales, much like another infamous serial killer, Henry Lee Lucas. Sells would often confess to crimes he did not commit, possibly to inflate his infamy or delay his execution. The Dardeen case began to look like another one of these dubious confessions. When Illinois detectives pressed Tommy Lynn Sells on specific details that had never been made public, his story started to falter. For example, Sells initially misidentified how Elaine's body was positioned when found, then blurted out a correct detail only after being corrected. He also insisted that he shot Keith while Keith was seated in a particular spot in the car, a claim disproven by the forensic evidence in the vehicle. These inconsistencies cast serious doubt on Sells' credibility, at least whatever was left of it. As Jefferson County State's Attorney Doug Hoffman later noted, there was a lot of ambiguity in Sells' account. Nothing that completely disproved his guilt, but nothing that would confirm it either. On one hand, Sells knew a few general facts about the case, likely gleaned from media coverage. On the other, when quizzed about unreported clues, he often guessed wrong. This pattern suggested that Sells might have been opportunistically claiming credit, rather than speaking as an actual eyewitness. Even those officers who treated Sells as the prime suspect acknowledged that he likely embellished his account, a habit he had shown in other cases. Crucially, there was zero physical evidence linking him to the Dardeen murders. There were no fingerprints, no DNA, no eyewitnesses who had seen him in Ena, or even the surrounding area. Hoping to resolve the uncertainty, Illinois authorities wanted to bring Sells to the crime scene to see if he could identify undisclosed locations or missing evidence. But Texas officials refused to release a death row inmate for a field visit. With only a shaky confession and no cooperation from the state of Texas, Illinois prosecutors were stymied. They ultimately declined to charge Tommy Lynn Sells for the Dardeen case, citing insufficient evidence. In April 2014, Tommy Lynn Sells was executed in Texas for a different murder he had committed, taking any possible secrets about Ena to his grave. This left the Dardeen investigation officially unsolved, and once again, the real killer at large. To this day, no other suspects have been publicly identified in the Dardeen family murders. Local law enforcement pursued numerous leads over the years, everything from ex-cons in the area to complete strangers passing through, but nothing ever panned out. For a while, Tommy Lynn Sells' confession was the most promising break, but with its credibility in doubt, the Dardeen case remains a haunting question mark. Even Joanne Dardeen, Keith's mother, who initially felt sure that Sells was the guy, lost faith as the inconsistencies mounted. "The things he said do not match up with what I know about Keith," she later said. Those who knew Keith agree. He was exceedingly careful around strangers, to the point of refusing a young woman entry to his home when she asked to use the phone months before the murder. It was hard to imagine him inviting a drifter in for dinner, especially one that he met at a truck stop that day, as Sells claimed. Nor did friends think Keith capable of the bizarre sexual advance that Sells alleged. Police found no evidence of any such behavior in his background. In short, the confession by Tommy Lynn Sells left more questions than answers. As of now, the identity of the killer or killers who slaughtered the Dardeen family in 1987 remain unknown. The file is still open, awaiting the piece of evidence or the stroke of luck that could finally name the person behind this nightmarish crime. Decades later, the Dardeen case continues to be actively reviewed, and the passage of time has brought new tools to the fight for justice. In recent years, Illinois investigators have leveraged advances in forensic science to re-examine the evidence with fresh eyes. Cold case detectives have been retesting items from the crime scene: the baseball bat, bindings, clothing, and anything that might hold a trace of the killer's DNA, using modern techniques far more sensitive than those available in 1987. Back then, DNA profiling was in its infancy and required large, high-quality samples. But today's labs can detect touch DNA from the slightest skin cells or bodily fluids. Jefferson County investigators remain hopeful that even after all this time, something collected in the original investigation can yield a viable genetic profile. If so, it could be run through national databases, or even used in a forensic genealogy search, the same method that identified the Golden State Killer, to pinpoint the killer's relatives. So far, no public announcements have been made about a DNA match in the Dardeen case, but the fact that evidence is being tested with new technology is a sign that the case is far from forgotten. Detective Captain Scott Burge, who currently heads the case, has described how massive the file has become over time. There are 21 binders, each 4 inches thick, filled with reports, photographs, and interviews. It feels like it moves slow, Burge admitted, acknowledging the painstaking process of combing through every detail. Even though he wasn't on the force in 1987, he's dedicated himself to reconstructing the case piece by piece. Witnesses have been re-interviewed, old tips re-evaluated, and out-of-state leads checked with the help of other agencies. The message is clear. Authorities have not given up. Just as determined, if not more, is Joanne Dardeen, who has spent the last 37 years being the voice for her slain son, daughter-in-law, and grandchildren. Now in her 80s, Joanne remains resolute. She has made it her mission to keep the Dardeen murders in the public eye, to never forget what happened. "I'll never give up. Never," she told reporters in 2019. On the 30th and 35th anniversaries of the murders, newspapers and television stations in Illinois revisited the story, not only to recap the horror, but to remind the public that the killer or killers have never been identified. Through her interviews, petitions, and advocacy, Joanne has turned personal grief into a public crusade for justice. In the 1990s, she even gathered over 3,000 signatures to petition Oprah Winfrey to cover the case. While the show ultimately declined, calling it too graphic, Joanne pushed on, getting the case covered by America's Most Wanted in 1998, and later featured in several documentary specials. She has made the message clear: we need to keep it going, and the community has followed suit. Each year, friends and neighbors quietly remember Keith, Elaine, Peter, and baby Casey. Some leave flowers at their graves. Others light candles or say prayers in church. Even people who don't know them feel the loss, because this story has never stopped resonating. Despite the many years of frustration, there is still a sense that the Dardeen case is solvable, and that it will be solved. Advances in DNA testing, renewed media coverage, and the unwavering determination of those who care about this family all offer hope. Someone out there knows the truth, and someday they might speak. Until then, the stories of Keith, Elaine, Peter, and Casey Dardeen remain unresolved. Thank you all for listening to Unresolved. I have been your host, Michael Whelan. Research and writing for this episode was done by myself. Funnily enough, I actually put together an episode on this story for another really well-known podcast about 4 to 5 years ago, and I decided to come back to it because it horrified me so much. Hopefully I did it justice. To learn more about this podcast, visit the Unresolved website at unresolved.me. The producers of this show, who support it each month on Patreon, are Roberta Jansen, Sarah Moscaritolo, Ben Crocum, Scott Meesey, Marion Welsh, Crystal J, Jacinda Class, Lauren Nicole, James Weiss, Alex Kalogaropoulos, Annie Broad, Kevin Tweedy, Stephen Diaz, Heather Fiddler, Anna T., Cece, Marcus Mitchell, Tabitha Colvin, Trixie Fink, and Nora Urcuyo. Thank you all for your continued support. If you get a chance, please share the podcast with those in your life who have an interest in either true crime or mystery. Talk about it online, make comments on the True Crime Podcast subreddit, or on Web Sleuths, stuff like that. And if you can, head on over to Apple Podcast or Spotify, or wherever you're listening now, and leave the podcast a nice review. Doing so will help others find it in the algorithm and is incredibly helpful. If you want to go beyond that, please try and support the show either through Patreon or even PayPal by sending a small donation. Also, please make sure to go over and subscribe to the newest podcast from Unresolved Productions called Post-Truth. If you want to learn why America seems to have such a tenuous grasp on the truth these days, check that out. Anyhow, I'll be going, but thank you all again. Until next time, I hope you all stay healthy, stay active, and stay safe. Take care.